In Magic the Gathering, when people think about ways to cheat huge creatures into play, they often think of reanimation, effects that bring a creature back from the graveyard, or perhaps Oath of Druids, which lets you put the top creature in your library directly on the battlefield. However, there is one other prominent way to put a creature into play early, and that's to use an effect that lets you put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield, like Elvish Piper. A creature with an activated ability that lets you do exactly that. Because I started playing Magic in Urza's block, I think of this kind of effect as an Elvish Piper effect, especially because I built a deck that put big green worms into play with it and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. However, Elvish Piper is not the first card with this kind of effect. That card is actually much older. Legends Triassic Egg. Effects that let you put a creature from your hand directly on the battlefield are generally more expensive and slower than reanimation effects are, and overall reanimation spells are far more powerful. But these Elvish Piper effects deserve some attention too. To be eligible for this list, a card had to allow you to put a creature from your hand directly on the battlefield. I chose to exclude cards that let you put permanents of other types on the battlefield as well, like Show and Tell, as those effects are markedly different, even if they can allow you to put a creature on the battlefield. In all, there are 48 cards that let you put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's Quicksilver Amulet. It's an artifact that costs 4 generic, and you can pay 4 and tap it to put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield. True to its name, Quicksilver Amulet can put a creature onto the battlefield really fast, that is, at instant speed. So if you have one of those in play and a bunch of cards in your hand, your opponent really has to think twice about how to spend their turn, partly because you could put something down to ambush block, and partly because they have no way of knowing what you might have on the battlefield on your next turn until it's too late. While it was originally printed in Urza's Legacy, it didn't see any play in its original run through Block or Standard, mostly because Urza's block was insanely busted, but not so much when it came to creatures. So there wasn't really anything worth cheating into play at the time with this, not when you could just combo off on turn 2 with all kinds of nonsense. However, after a reprint in Magic 2012, it did see some play in Standard, because now there were plenty of awesome things to cheat into play, like the Eldrazi Titans, the scariest of which was Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. While you don't get the Time Walk cast trigger when you put it into play with the amulet, that's fine, because you can put it into play at the end of your opponent's turn, untap and smash in for 15, while making them sacrifice 6 permanents, and that's usually game over. It's also been successful in Modern, where it has appeared as a sideboard card in Reanimator decks, and an important one. When going up against someone you know is siding in copious graveyard hate, bringing in the amulet suddenly becomes a better way to cheat your creatures into play. It also has a single legacy top 8 where it was used in a similar manner. However, Quicksilver Amulet doesn't have any top 8 since 2022, so it is likely to lose its spot on this list in the long run. At number 9, it's Garruk, Caller of Beasts. For 4 generic and 2 green, he's a 4 loyalty planeswalker with the Garruk type. He qualifies for this list because of his -3, which lets you put a green creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. While that's a bit more restrictive than some versions of this effect, it's also a pretty powerful thing for a planeswalker to do, because if nothing else, the huge creature he lets you put on the board can protect him. He's also got a +1 that reveals the top 5 cards of your library, and you put all creature cards revealed that way into your hand, so he's capable of drawing you lots of cards, and setting up that -3, and he's also got a -7 that gives you an emblem that lets you search up a creature from your library and put it on the battlefield anytime you cast a creature spell. So yeah, like most planeswalkers, he has some pretty powerful abilities that can both add to the board and draw you lots of cards, and pretty much a game-breaking ultimate. As such, it's not too surprising that he saw significant play while he was in Standard, where he appeared in Green Ramp and Devotion decks. One of the nastier plays in those decks was to play Garruk and then -3 for Hornet Queen in the same turn. The Queen brought along so many Death Touch bodies that it would be virtually impossible for your opponent to stop you from running away with the game. However, Garruk has been inactive since 2014 and is another Elvish Piper that is likely to lose its spot on the list. At number 8, it's Smuggler's Surprise. For 1 green mana, it's an instant, and it has Spree, which means you can pay extra mana when you cast it to add any of these additional effects to it. It's the second option that qualifies it for this list, as you can pay 4 generic and a green to put 2 creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. You can also pay 2 generic to mill 4 and put 2 creature and or land cards from among the milled cards into your hand, and you can pay 1 generic to give your creatures with power 4 or greater hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So yeah, this is a modal spell that is extra modal, because if you have the mana, you can get every single mode. The first one is good at loading the graveyard and drawing cards, the last one is good at protecting your big creatures, and the second effect lets you cheat those big creatures into play in the first place. It started seeing play in Standard immediately after being printed, where it fits very nicely in red-green ramp decks. The presence of both Vaultborn Tyrant and Etali Primal Conqueror gives those decks something great to ramp into, but you can of course also use Smuggler's Surprise to cheat those scary creatures into play, sometimes at the same time. It's also seen some play in decks that use the Duskborn Overlords, who are also great to cheat into play ahead of schedule, and having a card that also helps you find and protect all these win conditions while also helping you get them into play is amazing. The Surprise has also found a couple of different homes in Modern, including Amulet Titan, a deck that's all about ramping mana and using Amulet of Vigor and Primeval Titan to do it. You can combine the Ravnica bounce lands with the Amulet and effects that let you play multiple lands in a turn, like Azusa. The Amulet makes the bounce lands untap before they bounce themselves, so you can tap it for 2 right away, and for each land drop in your turn, you can do it again. This means this deck can potentially cast Smuggler's Surprise on turn 2 and slam 2 Titans onto the board, among other things. You can also find Smuggler's Surprise in some versions of Eldrazi Ramp in Modern. While Smuggler's Surprise is also played in Pioneer, so far it doesn't have a top 8 in the format, but that's okay, because it'll keep putting up top 8s in Standard and Modern, and it's very likely to get there in Pioneer at some point too. Smuggler's Surprise has a good shot at moving higher on the list, as it's a new card that's already seeing play in multiple formats. At number 7, it's Ghalta Stampede Tyrant. For 5 generic and 3 green mana, it's a 12/12 with trample, and when it enters, you can put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. Yeah, that's the most powerful version of this effect there is. And he's expensive and all, but he gives you a massive body that's a huge threat on its own, and Ghalta is going to bring other friends to the party in all the decks that use him. As is often the case for huge monsters like this that are powerful but hard to get into play, it hasn't done much in Standard. Instead, it's caught on in the non-rotating formats. In Pioneer, it saw play in the short-lived Geological Appraiser deck, which was all about chaining Discover together using the Appraiser and Glasspool Mimic, which you would always discover into with an Appraiser, and eventually the deck could use Eldritch Evolution on Trumpeting Carnosaur to grab Ghalta, and put Doomscar Tyrant into play, which would let you swing for lethal. The Appraiser quickly got banned in Pioneer though, and since then, the Stampede Tyrant hasn't been able to put up any top 8s in the format. Modern is where it's been the most successful so far, where it almost exclusively sees play in Pygmy Allosaurus decks. The plan with these is to cast Allosaurus Rider for no mana, instead of exiling 2 green cards from your hand. Then you either use Neoform or the aforementioned Eldritch Evolution to cheat some huge creature into play. Gristlebrand is often the ideal, but sometimes you draw him, and in that situation you can grab Ghalta to get both the huge Trampler and Gristlebrand onto the battlefield. Ghalta has also found success in Legacy Reanimator, where once again, it can help you find a way to cheat multiple scary things into play, since you're reasonably likely to have something scary in hand, like Atraxa. And it's definitely better to get a 12/12 Trampler and Atraxa's huge body combined with her powerful Enters trigger. Ghalta Stampede Tyrant is going to continue to put up top 8s in both Modern and Legacy, and it's likely to advance further up the list since it's so good in decks that run lots of other big monsters. At number 6, it's Tooth and Nail. It costs 5 generic and 2 green mana for a modal sorcery that either lets you tutor up 2 creature cards and put them into your hand, or you can put 2 creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. And it has Entwine, and if you pay the extra cost, you get both modes. In other words, you get to search up 2 creatures, put them in your hand, and put them on the battlefield. Its Entwine cost is 2 generic, which means you have to pay 9 total mana for both modes, which can be tricky, but there have been decks up to the challenge at various points in Magic's history. In Block Constructed, Cloud Post decks could pull it off. With the help of some extra ramp, and when they fired off Tooth and Nail, they tended to grab both Platinum Angel and Darksteel Colossus, which were incredibly difficult to beat in a format with a small card pool. There were a variety of Tooth and Nail decks in Standard too. Some of them were Elf Ramp decks, which could also grab Darksteel Colossus, often alongside a Duplicant, to clear the battlefield of what might have been the best creature. Some versions of the deck also used the Tron lands to power out Tooth and Nail as early as possible. Other popular Tooth and Nail duos included a Chroma Angel of Wrath alongside a Colossus or Platinum Angel, and after the printing of Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker, he also became part of the deck, often making a copy of the Colossus right away to smash in for 11. In addition to the decks that would search up strong creatures who could just smash in for a lot of damage in a hurry, some other decks went the more disruptive combo route with Mephidros Vampire and Triskelion. Because Triskelion can remove counters to do damage, and Mephidros Vampire gives your creature a +1/+1 counter anytime it does damage to a creature, you could just search both of those up and wipe away your opponent's entire board. Tooth and Nail has also found a bit of success in Modern, where the plan was usually to grab Xenagos, God of Revels, and Emrakul the Aeon's Torn, which means you were sending a 30/30 flyer with Annihilator 6 into play immediately. Your opponent doesn't have a very high chance of surviving beyond that turn. All that said, Tooth and Nail doesn't have any top 8 since 2018, as there are just way crazier things you can do with a ton of Tron mana these days. At number 5, it's Flash. For 1 generic and a blue, it's an instant that lets you put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, and then you sacrifice it unless you pay its mana cost reduced by 2 generic. So this lets you put a creature into play at instant speed, and while you do have to spend some mana, if you do, you get to keep your creature, but the decks that have really abused this weren't actually interested in ever paying that mana. One of the strongest things you could do with Flash is just cheat a huge creature into play with a super powerful enters or death trigger, since it can let you get it way earlier in the game. Flash is a card with a pretty strange history overall, and that's because it was a card that got completely reworked after release in an attempt to power it down. In other words, it received a power level erratum, something we rarely see today, but was very common back in the late 1990s. The combo that got Flash powered down was Flash plus Academy Rector, a creature that tutors up any enchantment and puts it on the battlefield when it dies. The decks that looked to do this usually wanted to grab the insane card drawing engine Yawgmoth's Bargain. So after getting to work as printed for a few years, it changed in 1999 to have this text. Choose a creature card in your hand. You may pay its mana cost reduced by up to 2. If you do that, put that card into play. If you don't, put that card into your graveyard. This new wording prevented the creature from ever being put into play if you didn't also pay the card's cost reduced by up to 2. Now, the creature never actually touched the battlefield if you didn't pay the cost, so you wouldn't get a death trigger. Fast forward to several years later, and in 2007, Wizards of the Coast decided to undo lots of old power level errata since they felt it wasn't the best policy, and as such, Flash had the shackles taken off and became the card it used to be, and it was even more insane now since there were many more creatures that could abuse it. And this was immediately evident because Flash ended up dominating the very first Legacy event after the erratum was removed, and these decks specialized in putting Protean Hulk into play with Flash. With fast mana, you could do it on turn 1. When the Hulk dies, you get to tutor up any number of creature cards with total mana value 6 and put them on the battlefield. And with such a large card pool, there was more than one combo you could win the game with when you lost the Hulk, but the one that succeeded at the very first Grand Prix used the following combo. After you flash the Hulk into play, you search up 2 creatures, Karmic Guide and Carrion Feeder. The Karmic Guide reanimates your sacrificed Protean Hulk, and then you can sacrifice it again to Carrion Feeder, and then you get the death trigger all over again. This time, you search up Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker, then you use Kiki-Jiki to make a copy of Karmic Guide, and you sacrifice Kiki to Carrion Feeder. Then the guide reanimates Kiki-Jiki, and you are now in a loop that makes as many copies of Karmic Guide as you want, and then you can swing for lethal. Flash immediately got banned in Legacy following this event, as it was just way too good at comboing off in the extreme early game. Flash also got restricted in Vintage in 2008, and it's banned in Commander too, since there are just way too many busted ways to win with this card. If you want an even deeper dive on Flash Hulk decks, by the way, I do have a whole video about that. Anyway, Flash went quiet for a pretty long time as a result of all those bans and restrictions, but the one copy that was allowed started to find its way into Vintage Oath of Druid decks starting in 2023. These decks mostly use the eponymous enchantment to cheat creatures, usually Atraxa these days, into play, but Flash was an alternate way to do the job, at which point Atraxa's trigger could usually set things up for you to get another Atraxa into play permanently and win the game with it. Flash is still putting up top 8s in Vintage right now, and it could move higher on the list in the future. At number 4, it's Goblin Lackey. For 1 red mana, the Lackey is a 1/1, and when it does damage to an opponent, you can put a goblin from your hand onto the battlefield. That makes this an absolutely terrifying 1-drop creature in Goblin decks, since you can put something amazing onto the battlefield for free on turn 2, and everyone knows Goblin decks get scary the more of them are on the battlefield, and the Lackey really snowballs if it isn't dealt with. When the Lackey was originally printed in 1998, nobody really cared. There just weren't enough powerful goblins in Magic at the time for it to do anything in 60-card formats, but that all changed in 2002, when Onslaught Blocks showed up on the scene with a very heavy goblin theme, and lots of powerful goblins. Now you could put Goblin Warchief, Goblin Piledriver, or Siege Gang Commander into play for no mana on turn 2, and that made Goblin decks in Extended completely broken. They ran roughshod over the format in 2002 and 2003, until the Lackey got banned, and it remained banned for as long as Urza's Saga was legal and extended. Goblin decks have remained very strong in Legacy though, where the Lackey is still legal, and while Goblin decks have had ups and downs in the format over the years, Goblin decks have virtually always been at least somewhat viable in the format, and right now they certainly are, largely because of the printing of Muxus Goblin Grandee, which is now Goblin Lackey's best friend because putting Muxus into play on turn 2 is way more absurd than even putting Siege Gang Commander into play, because when it enters it puts a ton of goblins from the top of your deck directly onto the battlefield. Goblin Lackey is going to continue to accumulate points in Legacy going forward, but it's not doing it so quickly that it can probably ever do better than number 4 on this list. At number 3, it's Sorin, Imperious Bloodlord. For 2 generic and a black, he's a planeswalker that starts with 4 loyalty, and he gets on this list thanks to his -3, which lets you put a vampire creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. So like Goblin Lackey, this ability is more restrictive than others on the list. It's also great that Sorin can use the ability immediately and still stick around. He's also got 2 other abilities that love vampires. His first +1 gives a creature Death Touch and Lifelink until end of turn, and it gets a +1/+1 counter if that creature is a vampire. His second +1 lets you sacrifice a vampire, and when you do 3 to any target and gain 3 life. So it's no secret what kind of deck Sorin sees play in, and in addition to being great with small vampires because of his first 2 abilities, his -3 has also been used over the years to cheat 2 different vampires into play most often. In Standard and Pioneer, it was putting Champion of Dusk on the battlefield, which draws you a bunch of cards and gives you a pretty big body for turn 3. However, those decks were never incredible in either format, but that would all change in 2023 with the printing of Vein Ripper. This is a huge vampire that can end the game in a few swings, and it makes your opponent 2 for 1 themselves to kill it because of Ward, and perhaps most importantly of all, anytime any creature dies, your opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So even if they do kill it, your opponent has to lose 4 life, while you gain 4 life because they lose 2 for the creature they had to sacrifice to target the Vein Ripper, and they lose 2 for killing the Vein Ripper. That's the fail case here, and if left unchecked, it just wins the game in very few turns. The addition of Vein Ripper and some other cheap and powerful vampires suddenly made Sorin into an absolutely broken powerhouse in both Pioneer and Explorer, and ultimately Sorin ended up getting banned to put an end to this deck's dominance. The Sorin Vein Ripper combo is so good though that Sorin isn't done entirely. He's still putting up a few top 8s in Modern now and again, often in decks that don't even have very many other vampires other than the Ripper. It's going to continue to put up top 8s, but it has slowed down in a big way since the bannings. At number 2, I've included 2 cards because they would have been back-to-back anyway, and they have the same effect, they're just costed differently and work a little differently, and the effect they have is typical of red Elvish Piper-like effects. Instead of just putting the creature on the battlefield, period, they let you put the creature into play and then come with 1 upside and 1 downside. The upside is that the creature gets haste, and the downside is that the creature gets sacrificed at the beginning of the next instep. Sneak Attack is the oldest and more powerful version of this effect. It's an enchantment that costs 3 generic and a red, and it has an activated ability that costs 1 red for the effect, and that means it's very easily repeatable. Through the Breach is effectively a powered down version of Sneak Attack. It costs 4 generic and a red for an instant with the same effect, and it does also have Splice onto Arcane for 2 generic and 2 red, which means you can reveal it and pay that cost when casting an Arcane spell to staple Through the Breach's effect onto that Arcane spell. So it can be repeatable, but that is really hard to do regularly. Through the Breach primarily sees play in Modern, where Sneak Attack isn't legal, while Sneak Attack primarily sees play in Legacy. Unsurprisingly, they've been used to cheat creatures into play who are absolutely devastating, even when they can only attack a single time. They've both cheated many of the same creatures into play in their respective formats. Emrakul the Aeon's Torn, who we've already mentioned numerous times, is one of the favorites because 15 damage plus Annihilator 6 is pretty impossible to come back from, but creatures like Gristlebrand, who can draw you a million cards to find more action, and the more recent Archon of Cruelty shows up alongside these two. It has a powerful enters or attacks trigger, and you end up getting it twice when you sneak attack or Through the Breach it into play. Atraxa is, of course, also a great creature to sneak attack or Through the Breach, since you get her enters trigger and can create a big life swing in a single attack. In Modern, Through the Breach has also been played alongside Primeval Titan, another creature with an enters or attack triggers, and the 4 lands the Titan can tutor up often have the ability to give you an insurmountable advantage. One notable thing about Through the Breach in Modern is that sometimes it's played alongside fellow arcane spell Goryo's Vengeance, and on occasion, Splicing Things does come up. Both Sneak Attack and Through the Breach are still putting up top 8s, but so is the card in front of them, so there's not much hope for them to ever pass it, and that card is Aether Vial. For 1 generic, it's an artifact that you can put a charge counter on at the beginning of your upkeep. You can tap the vial and put a creature card with mana value equal to the number of charge counters on the vial onto the battlefield. For a while, I thought about excluding the Vial for consideration on this list since it is significantly different than the other cards on it. After all, it can't really cheat a huge creature into play in the extreme early game, but the effect is pretty much the same. And you do end up saving a ton of mana by using the Vial to put creatures into play, it's just that you save that mana in the long run instead of having one backbreaking turn. In addition to potentially giving you a big discount on creatures, it can also put creatures into play at instant speed for no mana at all, so your opponent has a real headache on their hands anytime it's untapped and you have cards in hand. It has been really useful in aggro decks in multiple formats since they don't need to get very many charge counters on it to do some silly things, and it allows them to add to the board even more quickly, and aggro decks are always about that. It was so good in Block Constructed that it got banned, and it had more limited success in Standard. It really broke out in Extended though, where it was played in aggro decks like Goblins, Merfolk, and Affinity, all decks that it's continued to see play in multiple formats, but it was also played in creature-based combo decks as a way to get combo pieces into play at instant speed, like Cephalid Illusionist, who could mill your whole library for you. Ultimately, the success of Aether Vial was short-lived in Extended, but that's because it was, again, so good that it got banned. In other formats, the Vial is utilized primarily by disruptive creature decks who can gain access to powerful effects at instant speed. For example, modern human decks like to put Kitesail Freebooter or Reflector Mage into play with the Vial. It's also used in both Modern and Legacy, Hate Bear and Death and Taxes decks, which can find plenty of sweet stuff to do with the Vial. Aether Vial is just a great card in creature decks that have low curves, and it's going to continue to amass top 8s in Modern and Legacy as a result, and it will likely remain the #1 card in this list. So, those are Magic's best cards for putting creatures into play directly from your hand. If you like slamming huge creatures on the board way ahead of schedule, check out the description where you can find a Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at specific mechanics and effects, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.